Hello, my name is Sarah Kramer, and this is my presentation for my original contribution for my capstone for American College of Education. I have been in education for 10 years, slightly over 10 years approximately. During that time, I've spent 9 or so of those years in the classroom as a teacher. I have taught exclusively ESL to adults, and for the last year or so, a little over a year now, I've been serving as an administrator for a charter school in California. And so that is my new role in education. So that's a little bit just about me, just to get us started. So what I'd like to present today is, so there's a pseudonym that I'm going to use throughout NorCal Charter for my school. So we're going to call this the NorCal Charter Pilot Program. And this is something that I was tasked with supervising. I was one of two supervisors for this. And I felt that this particular program was something where I was able to apply a lot of my learning from my master's degree program. And so I thought this would be a really great example of a place where I was able to apply a lot of that knowledge, a lot of the things I learned in the courses. I will also preface this by saying I did take on this project before I had completed some of my courses, and there were a few courses, especially my research course, which I wish I had taken or had the opportunity to take before I set out with this, because in retrospect, I would have loved to have this have been more of a fully fleshed out action research and have that structure from the outset. That was something kind of we were building the plane as we were flying it. Um, I really think it overall went well and had benefit. And so this is just something I wanted to share because I felt like it was a really great example of a place where I got to apply my knowledge, and also a really great opportunity and experience that I can reflect on and think, if I were tasked with this again, with all of the knowledge I have now, having finished all my courses, what could I do even better the next time? So a little context for everyone. So NorCal Charter serves adults 22 years of age and older. So this is an adult-only school located in California. And at this school, we teach a few different things. So some students just come to learn English. Some students come because they want to earn a high school diploma. We do have a track, right, where we're hoping that all of our English language learners will go on to earn their U.S. high school diploma with us. And they also do have the opportunity to join CTE, which is Career Technical Education Programs. And one thing that's not on here, but that I will mention, is this is all free of charge to our students. So it's a really great opportunity for them. We do serve, I would say 90+% English language learners. That's listed kind of towards the bottom. Of those 90+%, most of them, again, are immigrants and refugees. However, we do also serve American citizens, native English speakers who don't have their U.S. high school diploma. So we do see both of those populations within our school classrooms. And some of the options that we offer our students, so they're seat-based options on the one hand, and online learning options as well. And classes are year-round, and we have what's called open enrollment, which means that we are always enrolling students. So a student can come at any time, join a class, start pretty much right away. And attendance is also non-compulsory. Again, this is an adult school, so as adults, they have the choice to whether they want to come or are able to come to class or not. And there's no penalty for if they're suddenly unable to attend. They just don't finish their program. As I mentioned before, 90% of all students are English language learners, so that's a huge percentage of the population that we serve at this school. And students come in, they have varying ages, varying educational backgrounds. So we have very young students, in their 20s. We also have older students, for example, in their 70s and their 80s. Some students who come in with master's degrees is one example of a varying educational background. And we have some students who may come in and maybe they didn't complete high school, maybe they didn't finish third grade. And even in some cases, we have students who've never gone to a formal school before in their life, and even students I've had in my classes who had never really held a pen before. So we have a lot of diversity just in terms of who is in our classrooms, and they come from countries all around the world. I believe our last school report card we had listed over 86 countries represented just in our student population. So this is a little bit of the context of these are the people in our classrooms that we're serving. I'd like to talk a little bit about the online students because this is the population that this pilot program was concerning and was created regarding. And so online students are so a little bit of background first about our online program. So during 2020, the COVID pandemic, we went to online learning. All schools across the nation did this as well. So when we went to online learning, everybody was learning online. As we started to come out of online learning, post-COVID, it was identified that there was a lot of students who had maybe relocated, who now had small children, who had jobs or who had lost their jobs previously, and now had new jobs that were farther away. And they were having a really difficult time getting to school. Also, their schedules had changed for a lot of students, right? They had a distance learning schedule and they'd kind of worked their life schedule around that. And suddenly the ask was, please come in person, and that we realized that that really didn't work for a really large group of students. And so our online program was born of this and still wanting to serve those students and not wanting to those students to lose an educational opportunity just because they were no longer able to come in person. And so a lot of the factors that go into a student becoming an online student include distance from in-person sites. So they live pretty far away and it's very hard for them to come in person. Lack of childcare, particularly infant care. So we do at some of our sites at NorCal Charter, we do have childcare available. And this is for children starting at the age 2.5, 3 years old. They do have to be potty trained. Infant care is a huge barrier because we have young mothers who just aren't able to bring their children to class. We can't have children in the classroom, but their children are also not eligible for the play care daycare center yet. And so this is a big challenge as well. Also, some sites just don't have this. Some of our larger ones do, our smaller ones might not. And depending on where that student is able to attend or where the student's enrolled, they might not have access to that. Also, lack of transportation. This could also mean that there's shared transportation in the household. So if there's one car and 5 adult members who need that car, right, or are using that car to get to work. So buses. We do provide bus passes, but buses are not always an option for our students. If they're taking 10 buses to come to school, they might be spending all day on a bus, which is not an ideal situation for them, especially because they have to take care of things at home, all of that. Also work schedules, locations that restrict ability to attend in person. So again, some students may live very near an in-person site, but maybe they're working farther away because that's where they were able to get a job. Maybe their schedules prohibit them from attending at the times they would and the places they would. Um, and then sometimes we also get students who enroll in our seat-based classes and have the realization that their learning style preference that online learning might be a better fit for them. And typically we will get a recommendation from these teachers, again, because we don't want to transition a student into a program that's not necessarily the best fit for them. So we do coordinate with the teachers and talk with the students just to make extra sure if somebody is moving from seat-based to online, that that's the exact right move for them. So this is a little bit about our online students. And we ran into, and this is again, not a new issue at our school or many schools across the nation. And it began to have a particularly severe impact on the staff on our online school side. And of course, we're dealing with this on the seat-based side as well. And I do have some ideas and thoughts that were kind of born from participating in this pilot program, and also from my studies here at ACE, just about how we might go about addressing this issue. So the issue, it's right at the top there, the student to teacher ratio. So of course, online classes were very, very popular. And a lot of students had the perception this is very convenient. I can study from home, and enrollment skyrocketed. And so leadership at NorCal Charter Online had been tracking this, talking with staff, and realized they were reaching a point where they really needed to address the growing student to teacher ratios because it was getting beyond a point that the teachers could handle. For online, there are additional components because it is considered independent study where they have to do additional work that you might not have to do in a traditional seat-based classroom. This includes having students sign documents, verifying they've done the work, collecting work samples, all of this. So there's a lot of extra paperwork that goes into actually having that attendance count. And especially if that attendance is something the student needs for the county, DHA, Department of Human Resources, where they're required to have a certain amount of attendance in order to maintain their financial aid. And so there's a lot of students, who are looking for that kind of convenient option. And then also, though, this is becoming really challenging for staff to keep up with because for each student, right, there's a small amount of paperwork that goes behind verifying that student's work for the month, so that their attendance can actually count. So things that were done previously to try to help catch up on hiring. So our solution for this on the online school side, I will also just briefly mention that I'm an administrator on the seat-based side. So this is something where I'm not quite as familiar with the online school, at least not like the day-to-day or first person perspective, kind of an outsider looking in. So I, know a lot about how they operate. But that's traditionally not where I've been a supervisor. So just a little bit of info there. So this was kind of a collaboration, what we eventually had. And previously, what our online school had done was they said our solution is we need to hire more teachers, right? So we could open more class spaces online, of course, so we can lower that student to teacher ratio so the teachers can have smaller groups of students so that the paperwork, all of those things they need to do is more manageable. And also because they wanted to serve the students better. Because again, if you have 100 students on a Zoom, it's very hard to give personalized attention to each student, even individual attention to each student. And so that was something they were also looking at too, was to improve the student experience, and as well as student achievement by providing the instructor the ability to have more kind of one-on-one contact with these students. So their solutions, we need to hire more teachers, we need to train staff, get them ready. And that takes a little time, of course. So there was a temporary pause on enrollment into online classes. So specifically, this was a pause on enrollment, but not registration. So students were very much welcome to register. And so they were able to come in, they could register, and then they were given an option. You can join a seat-based class temporarily while we wait to enroll you in an online class because again, we're working on getting more staff and teachers. And we can enroll you in the order that you registered. So if you registered first, so this began around November 2023 is when they put this initial pause. So if, let's say you were November 1st, 2023, that's when you registered, right? You would be kind of towards the top of that list once enrollments start up again. And so a lot of students made the choice at this time. They said, hey, we are really interested in the convenience of online learning. And so we're going to wait for these online classes. I didn't think they quite realized how long they might have to wait. And so basically by the end of December 2023, it was clear that something else was needed, that we needed to try to offer these students something else. And this is where the pilot program was born. And so the solution, so at this time, all we could offer them was seat-based classes. And again, we didn't have enough staff on the online side. And so what happened was a collaboration between the seat-based side and the online side. So we could offer them these seat-based classes. And so we decided, let's, target the times that these students are generally the most available, which turned out to be evenings, and let's provide them with a pilot program. So these are classes that are going to have small class sizes, personalized learning for every student, and high interest topics. And why the collaboration happened where the seat-based side was brought on board was because we have significantly more teachers on the seat-based side. Not that we were able to necessarily utilize those for our online classes as well, because again, the two schools kind of have their separate sides, and all of those teachers had very full classes already. So we couldn't shift the staff around. But the idea, we said, hey, let's give these staff some extra duty. Let's bring in some staff to teach these specialized classes to these students while they wait. And this was also another goal to this was we wanted to acclimate students to future expectations of a more hybrid model for NorCal Charter Online, because that was something where we realized that there weren't as many in-person interactions, especially student-teacher conferences. And it was believed that it would be really, really helpful for those in-person interactions to take place. Obviously not every day, but a couple times a learning period. A learning period is about a month to 5 weeks, depending on how the calendar works out. And so they wanted to also kind of add in this expectation of just because you're online doesn't mean it's 100% online. We do still want to see you. We want you to come in person. We want you to participate in the school community. And so they were moving towards a more hybrid model, and we thought this might be a great opportunity to kind of get those registered but not enrolled students kind of in that fold and get them used to that idea of I might be coming in person. So the student perception again was that online classes were more convenient, but not only that, but that they were going to basically get the same thing either from a seat-based class or an online class, and that one of the two was more convenient because we do use the same curriculum, which was a huge kind of factor in why they're like, well, we're just going to wait. And what really was a game changer, though, as we rolled this out and as we started to reach out to students to gauge their interest, was this idea of high interest topics. And the high interest topics, these are things that pop up in our curriculum, but usually during a specific month of the year, we have different themes for the month. And so these are all themes that are related to kind of daily life tasks that students might need to do. So we try to kind of hit all of those big areas. But based on the theme progression, right, these are topics that, might get delved into once a year during a particular month. But if you weren't there for that month, right, you weren't able to access or experience or go through that material or that curriculum. And so this was really kind of what ultimately convinced some of these students, because these were things that were very urgent and needed in their lives. They heard high interest topics, they got examples. We'll see some examples on some future slides here. And that was really something that caught their attention and made them reconsider their stance on whether or not they'd like to attempt to attend in-person classes. Um, and with that, I say attempt to attend because this was offered as try it out. If you like it, great. If you don't like it, right, again, our school is non-compulsory. You are not required to attend. If you want to go back to waiting for your online classes, that was something that was offered, is that's completely fine if you come, or if this really just doesn't work with your schedule and doesn't turn out to be for you. So a little bit about the student group. So that registered but not enrolled group were given priority because, again, those were the students who are waiting to join a class, essentially. They had kind of the options laid out of these are the regular seat-based class that you could offer, going through the regular curriculum, fundamental English, all of that. So that actually turned out to be approximately 43% of our pilot class population. Um, and the offer was also extended to students who are currently enrolled in online classes, and they were also given the option to try out the pilot. And this was only done because we were looking at potentially reducing class sizes as well, because the teachers were already at that point where they were overwhelmed. These students were also offered if they wanted to go to seat-based. Most of them didn't want to go to regular seat-based class. But again, they heard that high interest topics, they got the list of topics, and many of these students were actually very interested in that and said, oh, okay, I think I can step out of my regular class for a few months to check this out. And that was approximately ended up being 57% of our pilot population. And the initial group featured student levels from level 0 to 3. So this is our low beginning group all the way up to our high intermediate. So multi-level context right here. And as the pilot progressed, an additional group was added. An exclusive group for level 4+ advanced student was created a month into the project. I did not personally supervise that group. The structure was very similar, but because that group is then working on their academic credits, so non-English classes like history, math, science, all of those things, that was structured slightly differently, and we did have to handle that a little differently because at the points of level 0 through 3, what you're learning is, of course, your English, and then digital literacy skills, but beyond that, that's really your main focus, is those two areas. And so level 4+, there's something a little bit different and special done so that they still could be working towards their high school diploma credits, because that's typically when a lot of those credits are starting to be earned, is once you hit that advanced level, you have mastery of the language. And so I did not supervise that. So I mentioned that just as, to note that there was growth within the program. I did not supervise that, so that won't be the focus of this. But we did have this serving all students. In terms of the staff, so as we were getting those lists of who are the students who are interested, we also were gathering staff interest lists from the seat-based side specifically of who might be interested in some extra duty, working with kind of these small classes, high interest topics, just very kind of personalized instruction for these students, adjusting to what the students were asking for. And so once we had that final list of students, and we had that because that was very important because we wanted to see things like what levels are we looking at in the class, obviously multi-level, but how many level zeros, how many level ones, twos, threes, those sorts of things. But also looking at student needs, student languages, so that we could match the best teacher and para educators with the locations that be serving at and with the students that they be serving. In terms of the curriculum, and so this is, as we rolled this out, this is kind of what was pitched to the students as, would you be interested in this? And again, we totally respected if that was something where they said, we'd like to continue waiting. So our curriculum team was the one who was the group that created this curriculum and provided it for our teachers. Um, Teachers were given the direction, please involve students in deciding what they want to learn about, asking them what's the most relevant for you, listening to their requests. And we also gave them a lot of flexibility. So in the trainings for preparing them to go into these classrooms, we said, hey, if a student wants you to teach DMV, where's DMV down there? If they want you to teach DMV every Monday because that's something that they really feel like they need reinforced, like, you are totally welcome to teach DMV every Monday. Also, we gave them the freedom to adapt the materials as needed or supplement it wherever that they saw fit. So this is just a short list of sample curriculum topics. The full list includes this, so I can just briefly kind of run through it. So home buying, transportation, DMV and test prep, local housing resources, common housing issues and repairs, U.S. legal system, citizenship, workplace etiquette, U.S. currency, shopping, study strategies, school goals and success, health and body, making appointments, expressing feelings. And then there was also some basic grammar and writing that was included in there, but that was sort of as a supplemental as opposed to the main thing that we anticipated would be taught. In terms of the program supervisors, so there was two supervisors who were chosen for this program. One of them was myself, which is why I'm here sharing about this today. I was from the seat-based side, so I was kind of like the collaboration of, I know the staff on the seat-based side, I have familiarity with how things run on the seat-based side. And then a second administrator from the online school side. Because again, these are the online school students or potentially online school students. And so so that was the collaboration where we had two people from the two sides of the house collaborating and working together. And so the directive for this, so this was something where, because it was very time sensitive, it was put together very quickly. So essentially at that end of December, right, that was the time when it was determined we need to do something else. We need to try to offer these students something else. And we wanted to be a little bit creative in what we offered. And so the directive from leadership was to ensure students were supported throughout their time in the program, to gather data regarding the program's effectiveness and assist in transitioning students to online classes or seat-based classes at the program's conclusion. So to make a brief analogy here, the goal was kind of to, build the plane, let it take off, um, fly the plane for a little bit, and then, land it at the end. So that was essentially kind of what was done, right? We were handed a lot of data, student lists. They said, okay, have fun organizing this, figuring out. And it was also an opportunity where they wanted to see what we were able to do as administrators and site supervisors, just to kind of see how we could handle this. And of course, people were there supervising us to make sure that if, we missed anything, that they would step in and say, you forgot about this, please do this. So there was a lot of freedom, and this was kind of an opportunity for us to test our ability to put together a program, get it off the ground. There was some work that was done for us already, right? So the curriculum and so forth, that had already been creative. People had already been tasked with that. But kind of putting everything together and bringing all those pieces together. The pieces of that plane, I'll just keep using that analogy, in order for it to kind of get off the ground. And in terms of data regarding the program's effectiveness, so the main point of data that we were instructed to collect was to track attendance trends. And then we were given a little bit of freedom in that in terms of gather data that shows the program's effectiveness, and we want to see what you mean, what, effective data or data that proves effectiveness is to you. So a little bit of a challenge there. And I think overall we did rise to that challenge. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So in terms of ethical implications, so I will preface this again by saying I wish I'd taken my research course prior to starting this, but the timing for that didn't work out. I think overall though, so there's some stuff where I'm looking at this and kind of applying backwards, and this is one of those. In terms of ethical considerations, I really do think that in terms of what we did with this pilot program, it was something that really did genuinely cause no harm. Um, I think we did a pretty good job overall of being very clear in explaining the purpose, what are the potential benefits, risks, letting people know the participation is voluntary. And so this was true for staff and students alike. So staff, even if they'd expressed interest, if for any reason they were no longer able to participate, that was okay. They didn't have to participate and do extra duty anymore. And there was a number of staff members, not a huge number, but a small number who did have to kind of bow out partway through. So we did have some shuffling of staff. And this was just because it was a lot. It was a lot of work, it was a lot of extra duty. And that was the same for the students as well. If this turned out not to be a good fit, they had, other options. So other options if they identified a seat-based class they really liked. If they were those students who had been in online classes before and then they came in just to try it out and were like, I don't really think this is my jam. They were very easily able to go back to their online classes. And so for this right here, again, right, for like the teachers, of course, the small class sizes, the high interest material, kind of being given really a lot of flexibility within their class. Um, so we didn't expect any objections to that or that anybody would say, oh, that's terrible, I hate that. But again, it was if for any reason, right, they were like, this doesn't feel like a good fit for me. I don't feel like I can do this or want to do this. Um, that's fine. In terms of our data, so we made a very big point of ensuring, especially with the staff, making sure everything was collected anonymously. So like throughout this presentation and even through the data and presentations that were shared with leadership at the conclusion of the program, um, no names were featured throughout. So, we just were looking at really a lot of numbers related to kind of percentages to qualitative questions. And again, going back to those students, right? Students really had that option and that freedom where if this didn't work out for them, they weren't stuck here. Again, if their choice was that they wanted online classes, they might have to wait for a little bit. And we did have kind of a time frame for that. Um, but this wasn't something where if this really wasn't what they were looking for, they weren't stuck in this class. And again, as I said before, same for the teachers. And then overall, I think we just, in terms of ethical implications, I think this kind of covered everything it was. And I think that was owing a lot to kind of how we communicated with staff, with students. And so that's something that in a future iteration of this or in a future action research or anything of the kind or study that I would do, of course, that's something I'd want to have that clearly kind of spelled out in advance. This was something, that came up partway through, and I said, okay, let's start applying and checking and just making sure that what we're doing checks out, which fortunately it did. In future things, this is something that would be built out kind of in advance of the program even beginning. All right, the fun stuff, the data. So the data that we were specifically directed to be collecting and tracking, and this is something as site supervisors that we do anyways. So it was kind of the obvious one was attendance on the quantitative side. In terms of In terms of student achievement, we were going to base this on CASA's test scores, or it was determined by myself that we were going to base this on CASA's test scores, just because that is kind of one of the few tests that all of the students are taking throughout the school. Um, and then also one thing that I really wanted to look at was, and this is kind of folded into some of the questions I'm going to go into, was the numbers of students moving to seat-based at the program's conclusion versus online classes at the program's conclusion. I was very kind of interested to see what effect having that in-person class experience would have on students. I was actually personally very surprised by the results. I won't, no spoilers, but I was personally very surprised by the outcome of that. Pleased as well. So little spoiler there. Qualitative, so student surveys, staff surveys, going through and asking them, do you like this? What could we improve? What are very specific things that you found beneficial? What are significant gaps that we could fill if we were to do something like this again? Also curriculum surveys just to see, did the students like that high interest topic curriculum? Did staff like it? Did staff find it easy to teach? So kind of, both sides of that coin. And then of course throughout what's going to be included in here is there was a lot of supervisor observation. So things that might not have necessarily ended up in a survey, but it was just a trend that was noticed by myself or my fellow program supervisor. So I've kind of brought these into questions, so a set of 5 questions. And so these questions, had I taken my research class a little earlier, I do believe that these questions might have been a little more beautiful than they are. So for a more structured action research plan, I would have liked to have these questions just a little bit nicer. But so these are just kind of some of the areas of focus. And I do think there was a lot just asking these specific questions. Like I think there was a lot of good that came out of these and a lot of things that were learned that can now be applied elsewhere. So were I to do this again, I'd make the questions a little more beautiful than they are now. So for this one, because the questions are up there, I'm not going to read them. They will be featured on the following slides. So let's start with question 1, which was the curriculum effective? How so? And if not, why not? So in terms of just the idea of the topics, the curriculum was really, really well received. And this was actually kind of that convincing selling point for some of those students who were a little bit hesitant before to join. Um, and very, very surprisingly, I was personally very surprised of this by this as well. Um, because these are multi-level classes, so again, that low beginning to high intermediate, it became apparent really, really quickly. And when I say really quickly, within the first 2 to 3 weeks, by the fourth week at the very latest, but for most classes, much, much earlier than that. The immediate issue that was run into was that for the beginning students, so those level 0 1s, they just didn't have the fundamental English they needed to engage meaningfully with the topics that were being offered. And the intermediate level students found the material a little bit not necessarily easy, but not as challenging as they'd like. And so they would run through it really quick and say, okay, what's next? Can we learn perfect tense, progressive perfect tense, like all of those fun things. And so what ultimately ended up being the most effective was not the provided curriculum. Overall, that was something that we thought it would go over really well. And the idea of it went over really well, but the actual implementation of it, the feedback from the teachers was that this just is not working for our students, and we're not going to use something, or we're not going to, present something to them that's really just that it's either not accessible towards them, to them, or they've already done it and they don't want to do it again because they feel like they've gotten everything out of it that they can if they're the higher level ones. And so I think what ultimately was the game saver here was giving the teachers the freedom to adjust the instruction to what students needed. And the students, or sorry, the staff we have were very, very good, which is why, of course, they were chosen. So they were very adept at assessing what does this student need. And again, they're teachers, regular teachers, teaching regular classes in our daytime as well. And So for them, they already had a plethora of material that they were accustomed to teaching. They knew exactly what resources to grab. Um, and so giving them that freedom was really effective because then they were able to kind of assess what the students needed and deliver that. And I think also what really helped with this was smaller class sizes. And this is going to be a theme that I'm going to harp on just a little bit. The teaching staff found that kind of giving that very specific instruction, so figuring out specifically what do these students need and addressing it, it was much, much easier for them in a class with fewer than 30 students. So when we say small class sizes, the definition of that was less than 30. The reason for that being is, regular classes, you might have upwards of 50, 60, 70 students attending in a single day, and that's not even all the students on your roster. That's just who happens to be in your classroom in that day. Um, the implications in terms of the high interest topics for me wasn't like, oh, we shouldn't teach these high interest topics. We just need to teach them English so they can, work up to this. Um, because that was also something that then I got feedback later from a different group in our LCAP survey. So LCAP is related to budget and essentially figuring out where do we need to be allocating our money. And so we look at feedback from staff for that. We look at feedback from students for that. So this was a separate thing, not related to the pilot program. But what was really telling is as we were doing this LCAP survey for some of my sites, and my student groups, it was indicated, and these were also students that were aware of the pilot and were wishing they could join and were not able to join. But I think it is related in the sense that they might have been influenced by seeing the pilot, not being able to join the pilot because they were regular seat-based students. They already had an assigned class. And this was kind of a specific class where we were trying to keep these class sizes small for these students who are waiting for their online classes. And that was something that came up as they said we'd like, these high interest topics, but not in place of their fundamental English classes, but something like in tandem. So I'll talk about this a little later as well, but so kind of like how you have a speaking club, the idea with this was, okay, we're going to have some sort of small group, almost like a speaking club, but maybe it's a DMV club, or maybe it's a US citizenship club. And so for this right here, this was really telling that it didn't necessarily work to use this as a way to replace the fundamental English, but something that works alongside that would have been perhaps um, a more appropriate structure for this was what we realized. And so this did give me ideas for things we could do in the future. But this was actually something really valuable that I think came out of this. And what did students like about pilots specifically that could be more widely applied? This was the second question that I asked. And so for this right here, that my favorite theme is going to come back. So student surveys indicated that they felt heard, they felt seen by their teachers, they felt like they were getting exactly what they were asking for in terms of coming into class, and that they were able to share with their teachers, I need this, I need to learn how to say this, and the teachers, or write this, or do this, and the teachers were able to very easily, deliver. And they also really, really appreciated the opportunity to interact with other students in person, which for speaking skills especially, they felt they got a lot more practice speaking. So like those students who had been online students before and were now just coming into this, they really felt like, oh man, like I didn't get this many speaking opportunities necessarily in my online class, and they really, really like that. It created a greater sense of community that in person. And they also really liked how much one-on-one attention they were able to receive from the teachers and from the paraeducators. And also just the response time on that, right? If they're raising their hand, the teacher's going to be with them within 5 minutes. On Zoom, if you're raising your hand, depending on how many other people have their virtual hands raised, that might look a little different in terms of how quickly can that person respond to you. Um, and so none of the students explicitly mentioned class size in their feedback. They also might not have had the vocabulary to say that phrase class size. However, as I was looking through the feedback, the different things they were saying, I really like this. That kind of brought me back to the idea of class size once again, and not being a really significant factor in the staff's ability to adjust the lessons to exactly what the students wanted on that particular day to provide that one-on-one support in the way that they were. Um, Interestingly, nobody mentioned the high interest topics at all. As we were kind of conducting these surveys, that actually didn't come up at all, which at first I was surprised, but then I was like, well, that was the first few weeks they were focusing on that and kind of struggling and trying to make that work and realizing it didn't work and then pivoting. So that was just a really fun, interesting thing that nobody mentioned. Like I really enjoyed that I got to learn all about the DMV. It was more the focus of I really feel like I got what I wanted. I learned how to write, I learned grammar. So all of the things they mentioned learning, and this was not only from the surveys, but also from a lot of in-person interactions with these students, was related to their fundamental English as opposed to the high interest topics. And so the implications of this to me is it goes back to, are these smaller class sizes potentially more effective and they're going to create a better student experience, potentially better student achievement. Um, and this is also something because I know the online school, and again, I don't supervise for NorCal Charter Online, but just kind of thinking what implications might this have for how they build out their hybrid model, and how might they kind of incorporate some of these positives in there so that students are still getting the same feeling online as they are in person. So feeling like this is really, you know, this lesson has been adjusted to what my needs are or what my ability as a student at this moment in time is. Or I really feel like I'm getting a lot of one-on-one attention. I feel like there's a sense of community, there's a lot of interaction. So just things they can consider, improvements they can make to the online experience and over Zoom where they host their classes. But also as they're adding that in person, like, do they want to add a speaking club and things like that? So that's something that will be, under them to figure out and add. And my other program supervisor has all of this information as well, and these discussions have been had. So this is just kind of something that they could utilize. But for me, it also goes back to reinforcing my idea that smaller class sizes might be something that's effective. Impact in terms of impact on staff, and then if we were to do something like this again, how could particularly those negative impacts be mitigated? So staff were of two minds. So the first mind was, even though it was multi-level, which is usually like the scary type of class, and like multi-level, right? Usually teachers shy away from that because it feels like a lot, it seems like a lot. Um, for these teachers, multi-level actually it didn't seem to have as significant of an impact because the class sizes were smaller. And so they had a more positive experience despite that, because they felt they could be more effective in their instruction because they could actually attend to more of their students, get to know more of their students. So that was kind of the first part where they really enjoyed the smaller classes sizes, the ability to feel like they were being effective for their students. But then kind of the flip side of that was this was extra duty. They had another much larger group of students that they were serving in the daytime, and this was work they were doing in addition to their regular classes. And so that was a source of burnout just in terms of the length of time that they were working every day, week after week. One adjustment that I would recommend for this, and this is something that I think can be folded into a lot of those other pieces that I've been discussing so far. So we did have we hit Ramadan, the month of Ramadan, as we were going through this pilot program, and we had some staff, particularly paraeducator staff, who reached out and were like, I don't have the energy, I'm fasting, I don't have the energy to do this 5 days a week. And of course we want to make sure nobody's burnt out. Nobody is overwhelmed in that way. And so what we ended up doing was we had a rotating schedule where we would have staff coming in every other day. Um, so kind of this rotating staff who would be covering those positions. And I think for the teachers, so for all of the teachers, they had a pretty consistent, like they were there 5 days a week teaching this. So we started to work that in for our paraeducators, and I really saw an uptick, and this is more supervisor observation than, survey information, but I really saw an uptick in their energy, and in my eyes, their effectiveness, because they had kind of that downtime to rest, and then they're coming back and they're excited to be coming back, and they're like, okay, I'm ready to go. And I think something similar to this for the teachers could have been beneficial. And as we're looking at high interest topics and things like clubs related to highest interest topics, I think this is something that could be applied there as well. Because if you have one person who's responsible for one thing for a really long time, and it's just this kind of thing that's on their shoulders and their shoulders alone, it does get really overwhelming over time. And then there is the potential for burnout. So coming to some of the more quantitative data. So I know there's a lot of qualitative data that was gathered around this. In terms of the quantitative data. So this was kind of the critical question for leadership was, what are the gains, what we call gains on CASAs. I'm going to refer to them as increases or decreases in scores. And so in terms of the gains on CASA's test, so are we seeing improvements? Are we not seeing improvements? So what I did for this is, so initially, of course, I took, CASA's scores for our pilot students, right? And what I said I'm going to do, I said, okay, I'm going to look at these and I'm going to compare these and see, like, just first basic thing, like, are they going up? And I found that they were, and that was great. And then kind of my next line of inquiry is, okay, let's look at classes on the seat-based side, but also the online side that have similar makeups. And when we say similar makeups, level 0 to 3. And let's just take some random samplings from these. Random samplings were taken from the first group as well. Like we have that kind of that full list of scores from the pilot students. And I said, okay, to be fair, let's take random samplings and compare these. And so for this one, for me, unfortunately, I would say that at the end of the day, and is this not just the nature of research, that this is something that I think there's going to need to be more ongoing study regarding this. And the reason I say that is because the data we had was great. I think the pool of data was great on this. But I think I'd like to see like I'd like to compare this to a larger pool of data and then other types of scores from other types of classes. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean. So for me, looking at those samples that were taken, so for pilot students, looking at their CASA scores, and so these are going to be our reading and our listening tests. And again, these are tests that everybody takes, so I think this is a really good place. Of course, there's other types of tests, so like exit tests, for promotion and those sorts of things that we could have looked at. But this is kind of the test that everybody takes and that we can very easily kind of compare everybody to everybody else with these tests. So for pilot students for reading, 3.75 point increase in reading tests, and this is the average, and 3.4 in listening tests. For online classes with a similar makeup, their average reading increase, and again, for kind of a multi-level, again, average of 3 points, and listening increase at an average of 0 points. And so for this, when we see like this 0 points, which we will see this again, this was owing partly to we have a lot of students who are increasing their scores and a lot of students who are decreasing scores potentially for whatever reasons between tests. And so we get this averaging out to 0. So we had just this mixture bringing, some of them bumping it up, some of them bringing it down. For seat-based, reading scores increased by 6.2 points on average, and listening scores also increased by 0 points on average for this group. While I think for the seat-based classes, we did see the highest increases and increases that I would consider statistically significant. So I saw increases as high as 13 points on the seat-based side, and I didn't see anything that, even quite touched that in the other samples that were taken. I do think just in terms of for the pilot students, that 3.75, that 3.4 for me, at this point, it's difficult for me to, fairly say that's statistically significant. The way CASAS works, it's about a 10 to 12 point difference of scores between each level. So this would constitute an increase in proficiency of like maybe like not even quite half a level. So that's why I kind of hesitate and be like, this isn't quite statistically significant for me, because it's not even quite representative of like half a level's worth of progress. Um, of course, not to say that the other scores represented here. So like 6.2, that's slightly over half a level. But also seeing within that there was a lot of full level increases within that, but then of course decreases that kind of brought down some of those averages. And not seeing that same range with the pilot students, that was kind of the point where I was like, okay, they all seem to be moving in the right direction, but is there more to this story? So I think what I'd be interested in doing is getting a larger sampling at this point and just looking at more data. So like the data I pulled, there was a lot of data that was pulled. It was very time consuming to kind of pull all that data. So this is why I have what I have for right now. And so I think in order to more definitively say, is this effective, right? Is this statistically significant? I think it would need to look at a much larger pool. And I think there's other questions that are related to, because I think the idea of class size is not just related to, wait, is a small class size effective? But things as well, like is a small class size that's also single level the most effective model? Or is a small class size that's, capped off at 2 levels, so let's say level 0, 1, the most effective, right? And where are we actually seeing these, scores improve in a statistically significant way? So for me, the numbers here just weren't quite there yet. But I think kind of looking at other instructional groups and what do their scores look like in comparison. I think that could be the next step in terms of this data and just seeing what the data for those groups say. That was a little bit beyond the scope of pilot because again, we're just looking at pilot and what was similar to pilot. Um, I think though, I'll conclude this little bit though by saying that I think it is really telling that none of the pilot samples showed any decreases in test scores. So that was one thing that did stand out. And I can't say definitively what that means at this time. But for all the other classes sampled, there were decreases in either reading or listening, in some instances, both. Usually it was one or the other. But there was absolutely no decreases in the scores that we were looking at for pilot. And so that I thought was very interesting. Um, so there is something to be said potentially in, because of the consistency of the students' attendance, perhaps it then became less likely. And we tried to, again, kind of get similar attendance as well. But because they were invested and because they felt like they were getting what they want, maybe they were able to learn more and kind of maintain whatever level they were at in addition to moving beyond that. Our last question. So will seat-based class experience have an influence on whether students join online or in-person classes, and what are the factors related to this? So a surprising 53%, I was genuinely extremely surprised by this number. A surprising 53% of students elected to join seat-based classes after the term-long or 3-month pilot program. So we ran slightly over 3 months, but it was approximately a full term. And the other 47% chose to not return to online classes. Some of them were returning, but they chose to go to online classes. And this was very surprising because it was initially anticipated that we'd be moving 80 to 90%. Not saying that this was a problem. This, if anything, this helped our student to teacher ratios on that side even more. And so it was very surprising because it was anticipated that more people would say, okay, I did this, paid my dues, want to jump on the convenient online classes. Um, but and not saying either that the students were unaware because many of them had actually kind of visited the potential classes that they would be joining. So they had an understanding of, okay, this is, if I choose to go to the seat-based class, it is going to be larger, right? There might be a little less of this thing that I've gotten in pilot with the not saying they're not going to get individual attention, but they might get slightly less individual attention if they're competing with, 60, 70 other students. So it's not they made this decision uninformed, right? They had a chance to visit these classes as well. But for them, they really, again, liked how in their perception they felt that it was easier for the teacher to adjust their lessons in person as opposed to online. Not saying anything against online teachers, but they felt like it was easier for those teachers because in real time they could see all of the feedback. Right, again, with Zoom, you can run into so many issues, and maybe the camera's not on. Maybe the student gets distracted by something else, whatever else is going on Zoom. So they felt that it was easier for their teachers to really adjust the lessons to their needs in real time in person, that they could get that one-on-one attention. And also, they just really liked the community. They liked interacting with other students, I think more than they thought they would. Um, and so this is something they've only been in their new classes for just a couple weeks now, so they barely had spent any time in their new seat-based classes. So kind of me on the seat-based side, I'm kind of keeping an eye on those students. And for those who went into online classes, the other program supervisors keeping an eye on them, just to make sure that this is indeed the best fit for them. And so I thought this would be worth noting because I think this speaks a little bit to the power of community and in-person interaction. And these students came in, 100% of them came in anticipating, I'm going to go to online classes, and that's actually not what happened. And I think so this was something that was really surprising, but also I really thought it spoke well um, of in-person classes, and also spoke to, what seems like convenient might not be the best thing for you as an ELL learner. And that's kind of what we want to provide as a school, is we want to make sure that we're giving them the educational opportunity that best fits them, and is going to cause them to have the greatest amount of achievement that they can have. So I wanted to kind of explore that. So in terms of outcomes and implications, so of course this was, the pilot program is now finished. And so I wanted to kind of reflect for a little bit. I have two themes that I chose from this for me, of kind of avenues and things that I could pursue in the future, and how I could take what I learned here, what happened here, and apply it elsewhere. And of course, all of this would be built out in beautiful action research plans. Right, all ethical considerations taken into consideration in advance, that would all be built in. Data collection would be, kind of established from the outset. I will admit the data collection was a little bit like, as we started in, we were playing catch up a little bit with the data. So for this would all be built out in advance, before we hit the ground running. And that was, again, something that I kind of wish I'd finished all my courses before I did this, because I think I would have been much more organized. Transparently, though, the turnaround time for getting this off the ground was extremely short. So I think there was also like a time issue here as well, where there's only so much time to do so many things, and a few things kind of, had to be caught up with later on. So outcomes and implications. So I wanted to talk about, so my first theme is the high interest topics. And so what was discovered through this program, and not saying it wasn't something that was like, oh, this is like brand new information. So from having been a teacher myself, there were elements to this that I might have guessed. But again, each student group is different. You might come in and have a student group that has, enough foundational English to navigate. And it was just like, for this group, they just didn't. And so high interest topics, so like that list that was shared several slides back, they do have to have a lot of foundational English in order to properly engage in the topic. And this is what the teachers learned very quickly. And so I think the better placement for this is not that this is something that we're like, oh, we're just going to wait till theme month to teach this. More regular interaction with these topics, I think, is very desirable and valuable for these students. And it is something, again, going back to that LCAP, students were asking for it. They were saying, this is something we need. And these were also students who'd been like, looking at the pilot, like, why can't we join that? Like, can we, fill that classroom? And I'm like, no, you can't fill that classroom. So I think for me, kind of moving forward, the takeaway for me from this might be better placed in a weekly optional club setting. Just kind of like how we've had speaking clubs historically at the school, but maybe it's DMV club, or maybe it's, this kind of club. And in terms of kind of what staff had mentioned about burnout, of like, if it's just on my shoulders, like I'm gonna get burned out, having a rotating set of staff members leading these different clubs. And so in this way, students have access, right? They're in a guided environment. They're not just Googling something and hoping, they can understand it or that it's a reliable source. There's a predictable schedule. But this is again something that's on top of, right, what they're already learning. So they're getting that fundamental English, but they're also getting this on top of that. Um, Also, in terms of, the staff, and I know this is at the bottom, but I'll kind of just touch on this briefly. With the rotating staff, right, what that creates is multiple resources as opposed to like say teacher A is responsible for DMV club. So any student who has a question about DMV club, their only option is to go to teacher A because teacher A is solely responsible. Um, Right, with this now we have the resources are spread out, or maybe it's teacher A, B, C, and D, where a group of students who have questions can go to any one of these four. And if teacher A is already working with somebody answering questions about, let's say, DMV club, that student can then go to teacher B, teacher C, teacher D. And so it doesn't all fall just to one teacher to kind of hold that whole burden, and carry that whole load. Um, Other kind of things that could be done with this, because I know our students have varying schedules and some days they just can't make it. And I know that's a huge concern for students is when they miss something and then they panic and they feel like I missed it. It's never gonna come back. And that's especially for theme months. I think that's an issue that comes with theme months is if the student is just physically not there because they weren't registered or enrolled at that time, or maybe they come in at the tail end, or maybe it's just not that month. And you're like, I really have questions about DMV and it's not transportation month. So this is also something where it's almost like we could have like an online kind of like an archive library where we can record sessions for later access. But this also gives students a chance to revisit the material. So maybe they were there and they're just like, I think I need to listen to that again. I think I want to hear how my teacher pronounces this specific word. And so it's something where they can revisit that and at their own pace go through that material. And so they don't have to worry about missing things in real time. They can re-listen, they can study. If, for example, they weren't there for whatever reason, they can be caught up so that they're not behind when they get to the next session. And again, just at the end, kind of they will have those multiple resources of, this won't be just one staff member who's heading these different high interest topic clubs. It'll be multiple staff members and they will have multiple kind of points of access and resource for them to get questions answered, to reach out, get clarification, all of those good things. And I think for that, that's going to be really key and critical because I think the success of our students is also hinging on the success and how well we care for our staff. And as somebody who supervises almost 40 staff members at this point, it's between 38 and 40. I have to go back and recount. But as somebody who supervises a lot of staff members, that's something that I, as an administrator, I have to prioritize because if my staff are feeling burnt out, right, if they're not able to bring their best selves because they're worn out, they're tired, um, that's going to have an impact on the students. So finding ways to give our students more, but in a way that's not going to be detrimental to the staff. And then smaller class sizes, my favorite thing. So I think in terms of the test scores, so I was hoping for a resounding like, oh my gosh, 15 points increase. And again, that's hopes and dreams. So I was hoping that it would go in that direction. So I think it was a very positive outcome in terms of there were no decreases. There were all increases. They might not have been huge increases, but they were increases across the board. So I think that is, in a sense, that is very telling. And especially in a multi-level environment, I think that's a huge win. Again, the numbers were not quite as high to necessarily be considered statistically significant. They went up, but they didn't go up a ton. So I would like to look at more data. And just to say a little bit more about the data, I think would be useful to look at. So the multi-level classes, there weren't a lot of other multi-level classes to compare to. And that just comes from there's not because multi-level is not the ideal model. We just don't have a ton of multi-level classes. And so there's a limited number to compare it to. I would be interested at looking at trends in single level classes, two level classes, because I think they are related. How many levels are within the class in terms of like how effective can the teacher actually be? I think it is very strongly related to, well, how many levels is that teacher being asked to teach? Um, and so I think in terms of as we look at class size, that is something we have to look at. A smaller class size is great, potentially great. Um, but if there's too many levels in the class, that might take away, right? Or if there's, just the right amount of levels, right? We might see more gains and more achievement from these students. And so I would say at this point, the suggestion of the potential effectiveness of smaller class sizes can be very tentatively argued. And so I think it's enough though to justify um, future attempts to just kind of see what this actually means. Um, in terms of class size, I think the qualitative data, which this wasn't really surprising for me at all, was, staff positive experience for staff and teachers alike, or sorry, students and teachers alike. And I think that further and more structured action research on this is definitely justified, and especially because my school, along with many other schools across the nation, we're dealing with staff burnout, huge class sizes. And I think in terms of the qualitative data, having that evidence of them saying this was really effective because I had the time, I think that's definitely, a direction worth exploring. And of course, we're going to run into the same issues of, we'll need to hire more people, make sure there's space. All of those things are things we're going to need to consider and overcome. But I really think and I feel more so now that I've kind of completed this and been looking at this data for weeks at this point, where for me, a lot of this does come back to the reason why people like this so much, why a lot of the staff stuck around for so long is because it was very rewarding for them to feel they were so effective with the sizes of the classes they were working with. And they were able to really, it was really honestly very bittersweet when the program ended because they said, I'm going to really miss these students because I had an opportunity to really get to know these students that I don't always have that same opportunity in, my regular classes. And that for me really, meant something. So in terms of what's next, so I promise we're getting there. So proposed action research. So again, there was a little bit of an element of the plane was being built as it was flown. It landed without a hitch. Beautiful, came to a beautiful conclusion. Um, so what I would propose next though, so kind of just looking ahead, so while I was completing my master's program, I did create an initial action research plan, um, which aimed to study the effects of enrollment caps um, on staff and their burnout levels, as well as students and their experience and their progress, their achievement. So just to say that again, so kind of will enrollment caps have a positive effect on staff burnout levels in the sense of are they decreasing them? A greater, more positive experience for students, in kind of the perceived, like, do they feel like they're having a good time in class, but also like, are there the numbers, the achievement numbers, the test scores, those sorts of things to back it up. Um, what I really ran into, and I think this, and I included this because I felt like I ran into this in this particular pilot program and in kind of reviewing and reflecting on the whole thing. Um, so class size is something, it can be kind of tricky because class size reductions, it's something, I'll just read the quote, class size reductions in general education, which is what we teach, are some of the most researched education interventions, and yet researchers have not yet reached any final conclusions regarding their effects. So that was something I felt I ran into here. Because again, the qualitative data was like, yeah, this is great. The quantitative data was like, but is it? And again, it was again leaning in a positive direction, but not in a direction, and the numbers weren't again what I would describe as statistically significant. Just because I'm looking at, okay, what would be a significant increase or a significant costs gain? And for me, just to be, completely fair and honest, I was like, this isn't it. But it could be it if I were to look and compare and say, oh, maybe compared to XYZ, this is, in comparison significant. But just in terms of if we're looking at costs and like what's a level gain, for me, that just was not it. And so there is other research out there that kind of, has called into question prior studies, recommendations that online classes always be smaller than face-to-face classes. And I know we've done a really good job with NorCal Charter Online in just getting those online classes to a smaller size. We do have some advances in how that paperwork is collected and done that I think have streamlined that process and could allow for slightly larger class sizes. Before it was all, paper scans and those sorts of things. We have applications we're able to use for that now, and I think that was also something that it was just like this perfect storm of the applications were still being developed and they're doing things what we would say like the old school way, digital old school way, which was very challenging. Um, and so I think this is something that it's really going to be something that it's going to need to be both sides of the house, like not just the seat-based, but the online as well. Because at the end of the day, these students are going to have to go somewhere, right? We're not going to just say, oh, we can't serve you anymore because enrollment cap limits, right? And as our charter dictates, right, we can't refuse to register students. So I think this is something, and I think adjusting it for each side of the house. So again, because I don't supervise online, right, that would be, I can present what I have to the online side and say, would you like to adapt this so that this works for you? So I do think it's something that would be worth replicating on both sides just to see if this is kind of the way to go. For teachers, absolutely. I think this is what they believe is the correct solution, to their burnout, especially, and to them feeling overwhelmed and like they have too many students in the class. And as a former teacher, I get it. I've been there. And I absolutely kind of, if that is the solution, right, making sure we're making that decision because, the evidence shows that that's the right decision. And I think, in my position, I would consider it more of a middle management, to get the buy-in for upper leadership, right, the executive leadership, right? That's really what needs to be seen is we have to present the evidence of this actually works. Um, and so in terms of enrollment caps and the proposed action research, because action research by its nature, it's cyclical, it's ongoing. So this wouldn't be like a one and done, like we did it one time, it's over, we never have to worry about this again. Yay, caps, like we have a number. This is something where this needs to be a system that's set up of ongoing data that's being collected because these numbers might shift over time, right? They might shift up like, hey, this teacher has the capacity to take on a few more students, or hey, no, I think this really needs to go down because, for XYZ reasons. And so for me, this is something I think for the long-term benefit of our school, for our, students' achievement to, keep that on the uptick, but also to ensure that we're taking care of our staff because that's something that we absolutely need to do. For me, this is something that I would like to see this kind of system put in place. And then, as it's running, it's something that's it's ongoing running feedback, and we're making these adjustments as the data is telling us we need to make these adjustments. And I think this is something that could be overall really, really beneficial for everybody involved. And I think it's one of the bigger issues we're facing right now. And I think this is potentially the solution to that bigger issue. Um, these are my references. There's three. So a few last things I'll say. So for this, I really do feel very just empowered by my time at American College of Education. I feel like I have come out on the other side a much more capable and much more knowledgeable educator. And even though I'm not teaching right now, I really appreciated that everything I learned as I was going through this program. I was thinking, how can I bring this to my staff? How can I create a plan that's going to have a positive influence on my staff or a positive effect on my staff, my students, that are under the purview of my site? And so for me, I really feel like I'm ready to take these next steps. I feel like I have been prepared and then some. I've been through the fire and I'm forged in the fire and I'm ready for what's next. So I just want to finish this off by just acknowledging how grateful I've been for the opportunity, all the opportunities I've been given, really. So the opportunity, for example, to supervise this pilot program, which was a wild, crazy ride. But I feel like I learned so much. And also, of course, the opportunity to be able to study at ACE, to learn everything that I've learned, and to be in a context where I can apply that every day. So really, thank you for sitting through this very long presentation. I hope you took something away from it. And again, this is my capstone for American College of Education. And thank you so much for listening.